Hello, welcome, and thank you for joining me today. I'd like to start with a question. What to you is the most important developer-related feature of any software product? Hmm? Well, 9 times out of 10, I would bet my money on the answer to this being documentation. It doesn't matter how great a product is, if the people that use it and implement it don't know how to do this, then it's really not going to get very far. That's why, when we created Vendr, the latest e-commerce platform for Umbraco, we knew documentation was of the utmost importance. When we launched, we knew we needed to have a clean, friendly, and simple-to-use documentation site to answer any developer questions and make it a breeze to get started. But having a great documentation site out of the gates is only part of the puzzle. It didn't just have to be great at launch, it had to stay great. It needs to constantly be updated with new features as our product develops, but at the same time provide only the documentation that is relevant to the version of Vendr that the developer is using. It's ultimately these important aspects that led us to rebuild the Vendr doc site 4 times in 1 year. Well, hello, my name is Matt Brailsford and I am the creator of Vendr. If you want to connect with me, you can find me on Twitter via @MattBrailsford or via my company website at outfield.digital. Now, I've been building with Umbraco since around version 4 and have released a number of popular packages in that time, including things like Voto, nested content, and the award-winning Fluidity. It's the history of these packages and their development which has all fed into how we went about building Vendr and its documentation. When we created the Vendr doc site, we spent a lot of time planning how it would work and how the content on it would be architected. We took inspiration from a lot of great doc sites and did a lot of research into how best to break documentation down for developers in different stages of their learning. We also had some great lessons that we learned from the previous e-commerce platform from Umbraco v7, T-commerce. Knowing we would not only have the core product itself to document, but also a number of add-ons that we would also like to incorporate into the same site. And just to make things a little more complicated, each of these would need to support historic independent versioning too. So it was all of this research and experience that fed into a series of requirements which we would use to guide us through the different builds. So the first of those was a series of content requirements. So we wanted to make sure that all the content was set out in a learning orientated structure. So it would be broken down by different phases of the developer's needs and wants, and basically feed the right content to the developers at the right time. We knew there would be multiple products, so we had the core product and potentially a series of add-ons and payment providers and things. So we wanted to make sure we could document those on the site too. And for each of those products, we would also need them to be versionable. So people will be using different combinations of all of those under different versions. So we wanted to make sure that we could give developers the documentation relevant to that particular version. As well as the content requirements, we had some technical ones too. So first of all, we wanted it to be Markdown driven. So Markdown is really clean, simple way of writing structured content, and there's real low barriers to creating that. So we didn't want it to be too complicated, because the harder it is to write the documentation, then the less likely it is to happen. So keeping it simple using Markdown was a requirement that we wanted to have. We also wanted to make sure it was under source control and on GitHub. So whilst Vendr is a commercial product, we have the wonderful Umbraco community, which have always loved to get involved in things. So if there are simple fixes that could be made to the docs, we would love to receive pull requests. So we wanted to make sure that this was available on GitHub. It's also nice to allow people to see what we're doing out in the open as much as we can. Another thing was that we wanted to have automated deployment, so either automated or automatic in some way, but we just didn't want it to be a convoluted build process where it was really complicated every time we wanted to make a simple change. It had to be really quick, simple to get changes out onto the website. But before we get into the individual builds, there were a series of constants that ran through all of the builds, which I think are quite relevant to know and understand as well. So the first of those is the design. So I'm not going to show you each individual website that was built because frankly they all looked exactly the same. But on the homepage we had nice entry points into the various different packages available that were documented. For each of the packages we had things broken down into the learning orientated specific structures, and it would be help guide you through the different stages. We would have a list of versions, so depending on what version you're running, you could easily find the documentation that were relevant to that. And we would also have a change log, so you can see a history of everything that's happened for each of the individual packages. And this would be, each package would have these things for themselves. So the second constant that we had was the content structure, and given the bespoke requirements that we had, we needed an equally bespoke folder and data structure too. So it's important to know this because this was became the basis of all of the builds essentially. Everything revolved around this content structure. So how this was laid out was we had a content folder where all the markdown files would live. This was broken down into 3 subfolders. So there's the core product packages, so things like vendor checkout, the using plugins that are add-ons to the vendor product, and then payment providers, which themselves are add-ons but a very specific kind. So we broke those out into its own section as well. Within the core product folder, we had a series of version folders, which each of those contained all of the content files for that particular version, as well as a links.yaml file, which we'll see in a moment. Next to those version folders, we had the changelog file, which was the changelog page, and then the versions file, which is the versions page, which you saw in the design, and then more importantly, this package.yaml file. And this package.yaml file is essentially a series of metadata that would be queryable across the website and just holds information about that particular package that you would be viewing. So things like the product or package name, any image or logo that would appear on the homepage, who supported that, so whether it's a core supported package or community supported. And then we had details of the versions, the documentation versions for that package. So we could see what was going to be the upcoming next version, what is the current version of the docs, and all of the historic version numbers. And then we'd also have a series of links that were visible on the root of that individual package. So in terms of the links.yaml file, this was essentially just a long list of links that would be visible on the left-hand side of the site. So this could have been done in more of a dynamic way, but we started with this links.yaml file and it worked, so we stayed with it essentially. So for the packages folder, it works very much in a similar way, but everything is essentially moved down one folder deeper. So within the packages folder, we would have individual folders for each of the packages, and each of those would have the same structure that the core package had for each one. Payment providers, again, really very similar, but the difference with payment providers is they quite often contain multiple implementations. So gateways provide multiple ways of taking payments, and so a provider might have multiple implementations within it. So the way that we handled that is within an individual version folder, we broke that down into subfolders again with all the content files in those. And at the root of that version folder, we would have a sub packages YAML file. And this was essentially just a list of the implementations and which folder the documentation was sat in for that particular one. So lastly, the final constant was that of Git. So as I say, we wanted it to be hosted on GitHub so people could contribute or just see what we're doing out in the open. And so that invariably meant that things had to be based around Git in some way. So for our first initial build then, the approach that we decided to take was to use a system called Gridsome, and this is a Vue.js and GraphQL based static site generator. So we were quite familiar with Vue.js and would use Gridsome on another project. It seemed like a really good option to use. We teamed that with another service called Netlify, which handles the build and deployment side of things. So how this looks from an architectural perspective is something along these lines. So we would have all the Markdown and YAML files living in a Git repository alongside all of the Vue.js based and GraphQL query view templates. So those templates are what will build our pages. So those live in a Git repository, and then how the whole process of deployment works is whenever a file is changed, that gets pushed up to GitHub, which in turn triggers a GitHub app to notify Netlify that a change has been made, and that in turn will trigger a build of the site. So how that works is that will fire up Gridsome, tell it to run its build routine. That will generate an in-memory GraphQL database, and then the Vue.js templates will perform queries on that database and pull out all of the content that's going to make up all the pages on the site. So those all get generated into HTML files, and what Netlify does is takes all of those HTML files and distributes them onto a CDN. So the great thing there with all of the files being on a CDN means whenever anybody requests any of the pages on the site, it's really super quick to access that data and that content. The downside to that is it's all part of an upfront build process. So there's a longer build process, but a really quick access to those files. Now, it's that build process that ultimately caused a bit of a problem for us. So over time, we started to see some build timeout issues, and things started not to be deployed and pushed out on the site. And the reason for this was ultimately down to our versioning strategy. So as you may remember from the content and folder structure, the way that we handled versions was to have version folders with complete copies of the documentation. So all of the content, all of the Markdown files, all of the YAML files for a particular version were duplicated in each folder. So it's not too bad for much of the sections. So all the how-to guides and the key concepts docs, there's not really that much of it. But when you get to the reference section, those were all generated based upon the code itself within Vendr. So there was really quite a lot of pages there. And so when you're duplicating that a lot of times for each version, then it really became a problem for the build step. And it was just taking way too long. And eventually it was timing out and content just wasn't getting deployed onto the site. So we did look at a few options, so to see what was there available to help. There were some cache plugins available that we tried, but unfortunately they only cached certain elements of the build process, and ultimately we still had all of the pages to build, so we couldn't really speed that up using any of these plugins. What we ultimately needed was a way of doing incremental builds, and there is an issue for this on the Gridsome issue tracker. Unfortunately, they haven't made any progress, and it's been there for a couple of years. Now, I don't really see that as being a slight on Gridsome. This is a problem for a lot of static site generators, and it's a really tough one to tackle. And Gridsome just obviously haven't managed to do that yet. Neither have a lot of others. But ultimately, that was the big problem as to why we couldn't stick with Gridsome in the end. And so this was the nail in the coffin for this solution. Now for build 2, we decided to go with a very similar approach to see if we could try and reuse a lot that we had already done. So for this, we decided to go with another static site generator and a Vue.js based one called Nuxt. And a plugin called Nuxt Content to handle the Markdown conversion into HTML, and still teaming that with Netlify. Now there was a reason why we decided to go this route. So we had seen recently that Nuxt had done a lot of work in really bringing their build times down. So it was way more performant and was just had much speedier builds. And we're also seeing quite a few results in terms of potentially being able to do incremental builds. So from an architecture perspective, it's really pretty similar to how Gridsome worked. The only difference really is that there's no longer a GraphQL layer. Instead, the Nuxt content plugin handles the taking the Markdown and YAML files and converting those into like an in-memory series of data points that the Vue.js templates could then use to render that HTML. But it's the exact same process in terms of pushing to GitHub, triggering Netlify to run a build and distribute HTML files on a CDM. And it worked. We spent a lot of time implementing this, and it was really close to deployment. However, the reality is, at the end of the day, it was still a static site generator, and I think I ultimately chose this for vanity reasons. I am a Vue.js guy. I built Gridsome, that's Vue.js based, and this seemed like a good way of learning and playing around with Nuxt. And I think I let the speed improvement research that I'd seen kind of jade my vision to use it and go full hog and get it all implemented without even testing that I could bring the build times down. And they were a lot faster, but my problem was I was still going to hit that timeout at some point. I might have fixed it now, but I'm still going to be creating multiple version folders every time I release a new version of the product. So I just thought this problem is probably going to come back again in time. It was a bit silly of me to go this route, and really I think I just did it because I wanted to learn and play around with Nuxt.js. So for build 3, I decided to quit on static site generators and go a completely different route. And so being an Umbraco developer, I decided to see what we could actually do with Umbraco. I didn't want to write the documentation in Umbraco, and thankfully I knew there was another example out there that I could use as a bit of guidance. So Umbraco themselves, their documentation site is hosted on an Umbraco instance. However, all of their content files, all of the content for the site is driven by Markdown as well, and this is located in a GitHub repository. So I knew they must have been doing something fairly interesting to make that work, and they were. And thankfully, because our Umbraco site is available on GitHub, I could see exactly how they were doing it and essentially use a lot of that code myself and implement a very similar solution. So what I ended up getting set up for this build was to have an Umbraco instance that would read the Markdown files from a locally cloned repository. So again, all of the Markdown and YAML files are stored in GitHub. Those in a Git repository, which whenever we make any change, that gets pushed up to GitHub and again triggers GitHub to notify that a change has happened. But with this route, we use a webhook, and we have that configured in Umbraco. So when the webhook fires, it goes to IIS, tells our website that a change has been made in the content repository, and then we use a .NET library to perform a git pull to pull those changes locally, and then they're available for when anybody makes a request on the website. And how this works from a feeding the content out perspective, any request that we get, we actually use an Umbraco content finder to locate a single node on the site. So we have one node that handles everything, but we use this content finder to find that node. Then we pass things off to a controller. That controller then sees what the original URL was and finds the related Markdown file and the package.yaml file that goes along with it, and it passes those through a pipeline that we built, so that will convert the Markdown and the YAML files into an in-memory model. That then gets used by some Razor templates and generates the HTML output dynamically on the fly per request. So this all worked and it was great. We knew this is how Umbraco did it, but ultimately, we kind of felt this was all a little bit overkill. Now, the Vendr.net website is Umbraco based, but we were actually building the documentation site as an independent solution. And so this all just felt like it was a little bit too much. We didn't need a database. We didn't need all of the login mechanism. And essentially, we realized we were using Umbraco as essentially a glorified routing mechanism. But it just seemed weird that we had all of this set up just to handle dynamic routes. So we decided to sack this one off as well, and we said this one was all a bit overkill. I decided to go down a much simpler route, and that simpler route was basically to use ASP.NET in its purest form. And so what we decided to do was actually use ASP.NET Core and use this again as a bit of a learning exercise. So the architecture for this is really, really very similar to the Umbraco solution, but instead of using a content finder, we use actual routing mechanism within ASP.NET Core. So all of the libraries that we used were available in .NET Core, so we could reuse all of those. But essentially, it's the exact same setup. We have the webhook controller to pull the repository local, and then we have the doc controller again, which pulls per request on the doc site, pull in the right markdown file, combine that into an in-memory model, and give it to the Razor templates to compile. And that was great. So there were a few issues, though, or trade-offs that we ultimately end up living with. So there was an interesting problem to do with a bit of a chicken and egg situation, where the way that file systems work in .NET Core is that whenever the website starts up, it validates that the folder that the file system provider is created for exists. Unfortunately, that folder wouldn't necessarily exist, because it would only exist once the webhook had run for the first time. So we had to do some funky code just to make that work. So another thing that was a bit of a trade-off was we got used to a few things in the Gridsome build. So there were a few Markdown plugins that were really quite useful in that Gridsome build, but they weren't necessarily available for the Markdown plugin that we were using in .NET. So we had to figure out how to create those, and it wasn't the most straightforward to do correctly, but we were a bit under the caution. We needed to get it done quickly, so we ended up doing it in quite a hacky way just to make them work. But we got them working, but it's just not the prettiest code. Another problem we had was when we were using static site generation, so Gridsome and Nuxt.js, those were essentially compiling the view components server side, rendering all that out into HTML and sending that out, which meant that when you loaded a page, all of the elements were there straight away. But in both the Umbraco and this build, because we're rendering dynamically, any of the view components, which we managed to reuse quite a lot of them from Gridsome from a visual front end perspective, they were no longer rendered on the server. So essentially on the front end, what we got was whenever you navigated to a page, a lot of the view components wouldn't be there, and then would flick it. You would see them appear like a fraction of a second later on. Now, it's not the end of the world, and we decided to live with it, but it was a little bit nicer and smoother on the static site generation builds, but we decided to live with it in the end. Another issue with view components not being server-side rendered was they were no longer SEO friendly. So some of the components had things hard-coded into them, which were part of the content, which we were relying on being searchable. And that was no longer the case. So we had to do some funky things by rendering the content in hidden areas on the site. So they're rendered to the page, but not visible. And then when Vue.js kicks in, then it pulls that content in and it displays it. So it meant that it stayed SEO friendly, but it wasn't the most straightforward approach. But although there were some trade-offs, there were some benefits to it as well. So we got to know a little bit about ASP.NET Core. So we knew .NET Core was coming to Umbraco. So this was a nice excuse to learn a little bit at least about how .NET Core works. So that came in really handy. So thanks to the fact that there's no upfront build process anymore, there's no degradation to that deployment strategy. So every time we create a new version, it's quite quick for the site to pull that version folder down. So there's not that need to keep building all of the versions all of the time. So we hope that's going to last a little bit longer from that perspective. Another nice side effect of how this all works is deployments are really quite quick now. So whenever we make a change to a file, GitHub notifies us straight away, and that pulls down a local version on the server really quite quickly. So changes are pretty instant in with their deployment. And we ultimately feel like this is a little bit more scalable, at least. So it might not last forever, but I think it's going to last a lot longer than a year at least. So we're happy with that. So in summary, I really liked what we did with GridSim. It worked really well, but in the end, the timeouts were just causing too much of a problem for us. And so the switch to .NET Core and a more of a dynamic approach meant that we could just feed the content dynamically and not have to have that huge build process. It did have its trade-offs. There are a few issues that aren't amazing, but I think it was worth it's worth living with those in the end. Of course, there's always a kicker, and for us, that came with Netlify recently announcing that they've solved they've got a new tool that you can use for solving the incremental build problem. So they've got something called on-demand builders, which might have helped us because these essentially allow you to run a build process for part of a solution dynamically based on requests. So essentially making requests dynamic and then caching the result once it's been built. So that would have been really handy, and that could have solved everything for us. But hey ho, we implemented a dynamic solution. It worked, and we're essentially happy with how that's turned out anyway. So oh well. Anyway, if you would like to find out more, then you can see the actual documentation if you want to go see it on vendr.net/docs. You can find the content, all the markdown files and YAML files and things all on GitHub. The source code for the ASP.NET Core site is not on there yet, but I could probably make that available. It's probably the fact that it's a little bit hacky that I haven't put it on there so far, but I can make that available if people are interested. But if you've got any questions, you can find us on Twitter via Hey Vendr, or me personally via @MattBrailsford, or you can find me in various other places on the Slack forums and things like that. But yeah, that was everything. So thank you for joining me today. And this was why we built the Vendr doc site 4 times. Thank you very much.